Greetings, everyone. I'm Cathy Thompson, Preservation and Long Range Planning Program Manager with Charles County Government, and I'm here with my colleague, Nicole Diehlmann, to share with you information about an upcoming architectural history of Charles County that we've been working on together with the Maryland Historical Trust for a number of years. And I am very happy to report that the book is in the final phases of design and expected to be published after the first of the year. So for my portion of the presentation, I'd like to touch on how this publication came to be, how it fits into the wider preservation planning strategies in Charles County, and some of the representative resources that were included in the survey that are now part of the publication. And then I'd like to turn it over to Nicole to talk in a little more detail about some of the contents of the book. So the title of the book is part of a quote from Isaac Weld, an Irishman who visited the former colonies in the last decade of the 18th century, just after a time of great political and cultural change. Weld was not particularly impressed with what he saw in the new republic, and when he sat down to record his impressions for publication in 1797, he described his journey somewhat unceremoniously, without entertaining the slightest wish to revisit it. When traveling through Charles County from Port Tobacco to the 18th century ferry crossing at the Potomac River, which is near the current Nice-Middleton Bridge, he noted that in the midst of these plains are several good houses, which show that the country was once very different to what it is now. So one traveling through Charles County 200 years later might make a similar observation, and indeed, the survey work that forms the core of this book was an effort to document and hopefully to preserve some of those reminders of an earlier era, indeed, a time and place very different than what it is today. Survey efforts in Charles County began in earnest in the 1970s with the seminal work of architectural historian Rick Revore, who documented almost 200 pre-Civil War historic sites between 1970 and 1972, and again in 1977. In the early 1980s, this work was continued by a series of intensive level surveys that eventually led to the listing of over 20 nominations to the National Register and led to the publication of Home Places, Traditional Domestic Architecture of Charles County, Maryland, which today stands as the definitive reference for pre-Civil War architecture in the county. So as part of this work, he produced numerous measure drawings of some of the most significant buildings in the county, which have been invaluable to researchers. And pictured here are just a couple of examples of his work, which included documentation of sites such as Maxwell Hall from the mid-18th century in the center, which is now owned by the Charles County Commissioners. And again, Rick was unquestionably an excellent draftsman, and here are a couple of examples of his work in that regard. Unfortunately, his architectural drawings are now housed in the Southern Maryland Studies Center at the College of Southern Maryland. And I believe the Maryland Historical Trust Library has copies as well. So moving forward to the recent survey efforts in the 1990s, with funding from the Maryland Historical Trust non-capital grant program, Charles County received funding over the course of 5 years to update the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties by developing a new historic context and surveying an average of 80 additional sites per year. So the comprehensive survey update was organized by election district, beginning with the Waldorf area, where development pressure was most intensive and the threat to historic resources was greatest. The survey effort was largely focused on the identification of a broad range of resources, but particularly those that were underrepresented in the inventory at that time. Again, the survey was initiated in 1998, and the first architectural historian was Catherine Getting Smith, who completed the first phase and began the second, and the remaining phases were completed by me after 2000. So the next several slides are really just to give you an idea of some of the resource types that had formerly been underrepresented that the survey focused on over those 5 phases. The survey captured post-Civil War domestic architecture such as brinkwood, which is uncharacteristically large and sophisticated for Charles County in that post-war era. Brinkwood, pictured in the center here, was constructed in 1889, and much more common in Charles County were more modest vernacular examples such as the Hetty and Tom Wright House on the bottom left, which is located in the Victorian village of Marbury, or even the Nordean Jackson House photographed above, which is a typical example of a vernacular Victorian. So Italianate-inspired examples are especially rare in Charles County. This is an example of one of the few that survived at the time of the survey. It's the 1872 home known as Ditchley in Cobb Neck. So these were captured. So again, post-Civil War architecture was a focus of the survey update. And examples such as this more elaborate example, as well as more vernacular and forms such as tenant houses and earlier quarters. And pictured on the left is the Poplar Hill quarters prior to its demolition. So certainly tenant housing and pre-Civil War quarters were a target of the survey update. Sacred architecture of the late 19th century and early 20th century was also surveyed, including examples such as the Calvary United Methodist Church in Waldorf, shown on the right, which was designed by New Jersey architect B.G. Price in a Gothic revival style and constructed in 1904. But we also looked at other more vernacular examples, such as the Alexandria Chapel, an African American church in the community of Chickamuxin, as well as significant landscape features and individual burial grounds. Commercial buildings such as the circa 1900 Dr. Higdon Medical Office, which stood near Dr. Higdon's home, featured in the center. His home was located in Wayside. And other examples of commercial architecture include the Gallant Green Store and Post Office, of similar age that stands along the Southern Maryland Railroad are just a couple of examples of commercial architecture that was captured as part of the survey. Barns and outbuildings, such as this early 20th century tobacco barn with an attached stripping shed known as the Cantor Tobacco Barn, was constructed in the vicinity of Patuxent City, and the early 20th century meat house on the right and the dairy on the left were common features of the rural landscape that were rapidly disappearing but were captured as part of the survey. And finally, the survey also documented agricultural landscapes such as the St. Clair Farm pictured here. So this photo was taken in 2000 in the early years of the survey, and this was the last year that this farm and many others produced tobacco. Of course, the state tobacco buyout program has essentially erased tobacco cultivation from the rural landscape in Charles County, and the associated buildings were made obsolete. So in many ways, the survey was well timed, particularly to capture the last vestiges of the tobacco landscape. At the same time, Charles County used this grant-funded survey project to really integrate historic preservation into the overall long-range planning and development review process. After the conclusion of the MHT grant funding, this position was made permanent, and the historic preservation planner position worked not only in development review, but also in long-range preservation planning to revitalize historic communities and to support heritage tourism efforts. A historic preservation ordinance was adopted in 2009, and the Historic Preservation Commission was established the following year. We've also worked on long-term revitalization programs that have been established in the historic communities of Benedict, Port Tobacco, Hughesville, and Pamunkey. Two notable recent projects, both with Nicole's involvement, include the recent nomination of Hughesville to the National Register and the upcoming nomination of the village of Pamunkey. So the Hughesville Commercial and Tobacco Warehouse District is a commercial and industrial corridor that developed around the short-lived but important loose-leaf tobacco auction system in the mid-20th century, and the village really includes some of the last remaining physical structures related to the loose-leaf auction system. It also includes a range of commercial structures that supported the agricultural business needs of the community. So pictured here are several of the more typical mid-20th century commercial structures, as well as the earliest loose-leaf tobacco warehouse in the foreground on the image above, and in the background, the concrete block packing plant. One of our most recent projects is the Pamunkey Survey District, which is a historically African-American enclave that supported the commercial, educational, social, and religious life of the community for well over 100 years. So in the next several months, we hope to refine the existing documentation and submit a National Register nomination for consideration in 2021. So pictured here is the Walton's Market, which served as a community gathering place since its construction. And also pictured here is the early 20th century Metropolitan Methodist Church, which served as an anchor within the village of Pamunkey and attracted additional settlement to the community. And then finally, in the upper left-hand corner, the 1947 Beehive Masonic Lodge. So over time, this survey effort very intentionally and I believe successfully laid the groundwork for a countywide comprehensive preservation program. One of the goals of the survey was to publish an architectural history of Charles County to really serve as a culmination of all of these survey efforts to share what we learned with the wider community and to inspire preservation of the remaining resources. Nicole was hired several years ago to complete the book project and has played a critical role in finalizing the manuscript, filling in survey gaps, editing, and overall project management. And really, without her involvement, this book would not come to fruition. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nicole to complete the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy, for that great introduction into survey work in Charles County. My name is Nicole Diehlmann, and I am currently a senior architectural historian with RK&K, but when I started this project with Cathy, I was working as a private consultant. My component of the presentation will give you a brief overview of what we learned about the county's architectural history over the 50 years of architectural survey. Charles County, as seen here in this 1829 map of Virginia, is one of the 3 counties that comprise southern Maryland, south of Washington, D.C. It is bordered by the Potomac River to the west and south, and by the Patuxent River to the east. The county was rural and remote for most of its history. The primary industry was agriculture, and most farms were self-sufficient. Tobacco was a primary cash crop, and in the earliest days was shipped directly from the farm, discouraging the development of towns. The primary means of transportation was via the local waterways. Charles County had a large Catholic population, and lay and religious Catholics played a large role in the early development of the county. In 1642, Father Andrew White, a Jesuit priest, established St. Thomas Manor near what would become the town of Port Tobacco. The Jesuits continued to occupy the site, and by 1700 had constructed a brick chapel, seen here in the arched windows at right. In 1741, the Jesuits constructed this large brick Georgian building that was described by a contemporary traveler as the most majestic, grand, and elegant in the world. The Jesuits owned thousands of acres in southern Maryland, including a large holding on the Blossom Point Peninsula. This 1712 survey of Blossom Point illustrates the type of house occupied by early farmers on the site. Female religious were also present in the county by 1790, when a group of Belgian Carmelite nuns established Mount Carmel Monastery. As the number of colonists grew and moved away from the first settlement in St. Mary's City, Charles County was established in 1658. By 1727, the town of Port Tobacco was established as the county seat, and this bustling port became the county's center of trade and government. Today, the town has several notable 18th century buildings, including the circa 1755 Birch House, which was a residence and store for local tradesmen, the 1766 Stag Hall, which was a residence for wealthy merchants, and the circa 1785 Chimney House, which over its history has served as a store, lawyer's office, and court, as well as a residence. At the center of town is a 1972 reconstruction of the 1821 courthouse. Early dwellings in Charles County were generally small, but built in a variety of floor plans. Most were frame, but substantial brick examples exist. Often dwellings started out as 1 or 2 rooms and were later expanded. The earliest documented building in the county is Sarum, seen at the top, which was constructed in 1717 in a hall-parlor plan. Spy Park is another typical example of this building type in the county. Frequently found in southern Maryland is a variant of this plan, called the room-behind-room plan. In these buildings, one enters the hall and proceeds straight back to the parlor. Paired fireplaces are on the gable end, often containing a connecting pent. There are many 18th century examples of this plan in Charles County, including Blackfriars. Seen at the bottom center. Another popular house form in the county is the four-room plan with a center rear stair. This plan is essentially an evolution of the hall-parlor plan with the addition of two small rooms and a stair to the larger hall and parlor section of the house. This was a very popular form in the county and can be found on many 18th century houses, including Wicomico Fields, seen here at the upper left. Center passage plans were less popular, but several examples exist in both single and double pile forms. Haberdaventure, seen at the upper right, was the home of Thomas Stone, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The main block of the five-part house has a single pile form. LaGrange, constructed circa 1760 with major early 19th century alterations, has a double pile form, which is also known as a Georgian plan. After the Revolutionary War, there was a period of relative prosperity in the county, and residents began to construct dwellings influenced by the Federal style. Builders preferred the popular side passage double pile plans, but often included vernacular features such as massive chimneys with connecting pents, which were common in the county, as seen here at circa 1780 Timber Neck on the right. Some of the finest examples in the county were executed in brick, as seen at circa 1790 Mount Republican on the upper left and Oak Grove at the bottom left. Most middle and lower class whites and enslaved individuals continued to live in small, roughly finished dwellings, but few examples remain of this housing type. Tobacco was a consistent cash crop in the county, and several early tobacco barns are extant, including the circa 1780 barn at the Exchange and circa 1800 barn at Spy Park, both of which have tilted false plates. During this time, there was also a growth in grain exports to Europe, leading to the construction of granaries and corn cribs, such as the ones at Rosemary Lawn and McPherson's Purchase. The second quarter of the 19th century was a time of great prosperity in the county, fueled by agricultural production and an enslaved labor force. Most dwellings continued to be built in the ever-popular side passage double pile plans, but these buildings increasingly reflected elements of the Greek Revival style. The Federal style was very popular in the county, and many houses combined elements of both the Federal and Greek Revival styles, resulting in an extended period of transitional buildings in the county. Circa 1850, Green's Inheritance is one of the county's most elaborate Greek Revival dwellings and one of the only to exhibit a Georgian plan. It is also one of the first to be designed by a Baltimore architect. The majority of residents still lived in modest dwellings like the circa 1840 McPherson's Purchase Quarter, seen at bottom left. The ending of the Civil War brought dramatic changes to the county. The shift from enslaved to wage labor brought about major changes in the county's economy, as acres of formerly prosperous farmland remained uncultivated for lack of a labor force. Some farms weathered the change better than others, particularly those whose owners' economic interests were better diversified, such as the Chapmans of Mount Aventine and the Greens of Green's Inheritance. Other owners, such as the Marshalls of Marshall Hall, who were heavily invested in the domestic slave trade, lost their properties shortly after the war. It is believed that the Marshalls housed enslaved individuals in the stable, seen at left in the 1960s. One of the most notable houses of this period is 1865 Thainston, which is unique in that it retains a full complement of outbuildings as well as the primary dwelling. The other major change after the Civil War was the arrival of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad in 1873. While steamboats had provided passenger and freight service between the county and Baltimore via the Potomac and Patuxent rivers for several decades, the railroad made the journey more quickly and efficiently. The line ran from Bowie to the wharf at Rock Point, and small towns developed at stations along the route, including La Plata, Belle Alton, and White Plains. La Plata grew into the largest of these towns, and soon there were calls to move the county seat to La Plata from Port Tobacco, the formerly prosperous town that was struggling because of the lack of railroad connection, as well as the silting in of the Port Tobacco River, which limited its viability as a commercial port. After a suspicious fire in the Port Tobacco courthouse, a new courthouse was opened in La Plata in 1896, shifting the civic and commercial center of the county to La Plata. The single most important development in the county was the establishment of the 500-acre naval proving ground along Matawan Creek in 1890, as part of efforts to modernize U.S. naval forces. In 1898, the facility focus expanded to include a naval powder factory to produce smokeless powder, which was an important advancement in the use of artillery. In 1901, an additional 1,000 acres across Matawan Creek were added to the facility. The proving ground moved to Dahlgren, Virginia in 1921, but the powder factory remained, changing focus over time to the development of jet propulsion and rocket testing. The towns of Indian Head and Marbury quickly developed into thriving communities housing many workers. The facility, now known as Naval Support Facility Indian Head, remains the county's largest employer. The development of the automobile brought new transportation options to the county. In 1909, the state produced a highway plan to connect all the counties. In Charles County, one of the routes was known as the Southern Maryland Truck Line, which ran from Waldorf through La Plata and Newburgh to the wharf at Rock Point. Robert Crain, a wealthy and well-connected attorney, was the county's biggest advocate for the road, which would eventually link Charles County to Baltimore. Ground was broken for the road in 1922, and its completion brought a new wave of development to the county. Seasonal resorts with small bungalows, such as those on Cobb Island, appeared along the county's waterways. Affluent individuals from Washington, D.C. and elsewhere constructed large country estates or rehabilitated historic homes in the colonial revival style. Farmers diversified their crops and produced items that could be easily shipped to the growing urban markets in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. With the opening of the Potomac River Bridge in 1940, the highway became a major north-south corridor, leading to the construction of low-slung automobile-oriented motels along the route. The road, now designated U.S. Route 301, is also known as Crain Highway after its benefactor. The burgeoning tourist and entertainment industry of the early 20th century experienced explosive growth after World War II, when Charles County legalized slot machine gambling in 1949. Along Crain Highway, casinos, restaurants, and cocktail lounges were constructed. In addition to gambling, these facilities offered live music and dancing. Large neon signs lined Crain Highway, attracting customers. This extravagant atmosphere and large number of slot machines gave the Crain Highway Strip the moniker Little Las Vegas. Some casinos, like the Reno, were on piers in the Potomac River off the Virginia shoreline, as the river is solely located in the state of Maryland. Slot machines were eventually banned in 1967, and many of the county's historic resources associated with the gambling era, particularly along Crain Highway, have been demolished for new commercial development. Other aspects of Charles County's post-World War II development are less well documented and will need to be the focus of future survey efforts. Charles County's proximity to Washington, D.C. led to a period of rapid suburbanization in the second half of the 20th century. Subdivisions with new housing types like the ranch and split foyer became ubiquitous on the landscape, as seen at the bottom left in circa 1960 Orlando. In the early 1960s, the county approved St. Charles, its first master-planned community, with a variety of residential, commercial, and industrial uses. The split foyer house, seen at the bottom right, is in the village of Smallwood, the first section of the community to be constructed. Other modernist-style buildings are found throughout the county, including Sacred Heart Church and the La Plata Library. Thank you for participating in today's symposium. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Cathy or I at the emails on the screen, and look for the book in early 2021.